At dawn, the Hudson River lies silent beneath a veil of mist. The sun rises slowly over the hills of Pocantico, casting a faint golden light upon a stone mansion that seems to breathe with memory. This is Kaikut, the house that John D. Rockefeller built not merely as a residence, but as a monument to a belief that wealth could be sanctified through purpose. Its marble halls, its manicured gardens, its bronze gates guarded by lions of patience and pride all whisper the same paradox, that the richest man in history was, in his own eyes, a servant of God. John Davison Rockefeller was born not into privilege but into moral discipline. He began his days not with luxury, but with prayer and arithmetic. In his mother's small kitchen, he learned the sacred rhythm of thrift. A penny saved, a penny tithed. Every coin mattered, every cent recorded in a notebook that would later become his spiritual ledger. The boy from Richford, New York, would one day hold more money than entire nations. And yet, to his dying breath, he insisted, "God gave me my money. Outside, America was changing. The mid-19th century pulsed with invention and industry, railroads cutting through wilderness, oil seeping from the ground like liquid fire. The young Rockefeller saw what others could not, that oil was not chaos, but order waiting to be imposed. In the flicker of kerosene lamps, he saw the future of light, and in that light, the glimmer of destiny. He was not a gambler. He despised waste, vanity, and excess. To him, business was not adventure. It was duty. Every decision was weighed. Every risk prayed over. Yet beneath his calm composure burned an ambition so vast it frightened even his partners. They saw in him something more than intelligence, a relentless precision, a moral certainty that wealth itself could be righteous if managed like a divine trust. By the time he was 24, Rockefeller had entered the oil trade in Cleveland. Within a decade, he controlled the nation's refining capacity. Within 2, he would command the world's energy. His empire, Standard Oil, became the most efficient, the most feared, and the most despised corporation of its age. He built it quietly, with the patience of a minister and the will of a monarch. To the public, he was a riddle. Newspapers painted him as a cold manipulator, the emblem of greed in the Gilded Age. But those who met him privately described something else. A man who rarely raised his voice, who read the Bible each morning, who tithed 10% of his income long before he became a millionaire. To some, this made him a hypocrite. To others, a prophet of modern capitalism. His fortune rose alongside America's moral anxiety. The nation that celebrated success also feared the cost of it. Could one man truly deserve so much? And could faith coexist with monopoly? The answer lay not in his wealth, but in what he would do with it. In 1911, when the Supreme Court dismantled Standard Oil, Rockefeller was already retired, sitting in his garden counting blessings instead of barrels. The breakup of his empire, a moment of humiliation to most, made him richer than ever. He laughed softly, quoting scripture, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." And give he did. From his billions would rise churches, universities, and hospitals. But before that legacy of giving came the crucible, the moral battle between faith and fortune, between public condemnation and private devotion. In the stillness of Kaikut's great hall, one can almost hear his footsteps, steady, deliberate, unhurried. They echo not of guilt, but of conviction that wealth, if guided by conscience, could heal rather than corrupt. The story of the Rockefeller Dynasty is not merely about the making of money, but about the making of meaning in an age that worshipped gold. It is the story of a man who sought salvation through spreadsheets, who measured grace in dividends, who built an empire on oil and transformed it into light. As the first rays of morning sweep across the Hudson, the marble of Kaikut glows half fortress, half sanctuary. Somewhere within its walls, the ghost of John D. Rockefeller still kneels in silent prayer. The richest man who ever lived, asking not for more, but for the wisdom to give. Before there was wealth, there was restlessness. Before the dynasty, there was a man who refused to stay still. William Avery Rockefeller, the patriarch, drifted across mid-19th century America under a dozen names. He sold patent medicines from a wagon, peddled elixirs of dubious origin, and vanished for months at a time. Neighbors called him Devil Bill. He called himself a doctor to his wife, Eliza Davison Rockefeller. He was both husband and burden. the unpredictable spirit that forced her to raise their children in the shadow of absence and necessity. Eliza was the moral spine of the family. A devout Baptist woman of Scottish-Irish descent, she believed in the sacred order of work, prayer, and restraint. Her home in Richford, New York, was small and plain, yet it pulsed with an austere dignity. She managed every penny, kept meticulous records, and taught her children that virtue was built in decimals in small daily acts of discipline. Her Bible was worn, her ledgers cleaner than her windows. From her, young John learned that poverty was not disgrace, but disorder, something to be tamed through precision and will. The Rockefellers moved often, from Richford to Moravia, from Owego to Strongsville, finally settling in Cleveland. Each relocation mirrored the father's evasion and the mother's endurance. By the age of 10, John D. Rockefeller had lived the contradiction that would define him forever: faith against ambition, order against chaos. He kept a ledger even as a boy. His first entries recorded small savings, a few cents earned from raising turkeys, from lending pocket money to neighbors at modest interest. The numbers were not just arithmetic, they were moral proof that diligence could redeem uncertainty. Every coin saved, every debt collected, was an act of control over a world ruled by chance. In the public schools of Cleveland, Rockefeller was quiet, polite, and relentless. His classmates recalled a boy who never played, never laughed loudly, and who spoke of going into business as if it were a divine calling. He loved mathematics, despised waste, and believed early that success was measurable not in flair but in balance sheets. While others dreamt of adventure, he studied compound interest. At 16, he found his first real employment as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a small produce commission firm. It was here, amid ink, columns, and figures, that the future titan found his faith confirmed. The discipline of bookkeeping, every dollar accounted for. Every number in its place resonated with his moral universe. Years later, he would say, "All my future seemed to hinge upon that first job. I learned to work, to save, and to give." His wages were modest, 50 cents a day, yet he tithed from the beginning. Each Sunday, he set aside a portion of his earnings for church and charity. To him, giving was not indulgence but obedience. He would later recall his mother's commandment, "Save when you can, and give when you must." That principle, part thrift, part theology, would grow into the philosophical root of American philanthropy itself. By the age of 19, Rockefeller had saved enough to start a partnership with Maurice Clark. Their firm, Clark and Rockefeller, dealt in grain, meats, and produce. Business was steady but unremarkable until fortune, in the form of a new substance called crude oil, seeped from the ground of Pennsylvania. At first, it was a curiosity, foul-smelling, unstable, and hard to store. But to Rockefeller, it was revelation. He saw in oil the same qualities that had shaped his faith: potential chaos in need of order, abundance in need of stewardship. In 1863, he invested in a small refinery in Cleveland. It was not the largest, but it was the best organized. Where others saw profit, he saw efficiency. Where others saw risk, he saw structure. Each barrel refined, each shipment accounted for, became a moral equation. Waste was sin, perfection was worship. By the mid-1860s, Rockefeller had bought out Clark and taken control of the business. He renamed it Rockefeller and Andrews, then later joined with Henry Flagler, a partnership that would alter the economic landscape of the modern world. Together, they applied the principles of faith and mathematics to commerce. Buy when others hesitate, consolidate when others compete, and standardize where others improvise. Cleveland, once a modest city by the lake, became the pulsing heart of a new industry. Railroads, warehouses, pipelines, all converged under the logic of Rockefeller's relentless order. And yet, at home, he remained the same austere figure his mother had raised, punctual, sober, devoted to family prayer. He ate simply, avoided alcohol, and spoke little of his growing empire. The contradictions deepened. He attended Baptist services regularly, his voice rising in hymns of humility even as he negotiated secret rebates with railroads. To his employees, he was fair but firm. To his competitors, merciless. Still, in his eyes, there was no conflict. Profit, if honestly earned and wisely used, was an expression of divine providence. "I believe the power to make money," he once said, "is a gift from God." The early Rockefeller household reflected this dual creed of simplicity and control. His marriage to Laura Celestia Spellman in 1864 united him with another devout Baptist family known for charity and education. Together they embodied a new archetype of American morality, discipline, prosperity. Their home in Cleveland's Euclid Avenue was grand, but not flamboyant. Visitors remarked on its quiet elegance, the absence of ostentation, the precision of its routines. Laura, known affectionately as Setty, tempered her husband's intensity with calm reason. She shared his belief that wealth carried moral responsibility. While John organized the business, she organized their giving. The couple began funding church missions, schools, and relief programs for freed slaves after the Civil War. These early acts of generosity were the seedlings of an ideology that money, properly managed, could serve not just man, but mankind. As the Rockefellers' first son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr., was born in 1874, the family had already entered America's upper tier. Yet John Sr. remained haunted by his father's wandering spirit. He kept his lineage visible, but at a distance. William Rockefeller died in obscurity, estranged from the family that bore his name. In contrast, his son built his fortune as an act of atonement, redeeming not just poverty, but shame. The moral geometry of his life, piety against profit, humility against dominance, was forged here, in the tension between two parents, the trickster and the saint. The son inherited both his father's cunning and his mother's conscience. And in combining them, he built something America had never seen before, a capitalist who prayed over ledgers and baptized competition in the name of efficiency. By the time Rockefeller turned 30, he was the undisputed master of Cleveland's refineries. But more than that, he was a man convinced that destiny had chosen him for stewardship. In his personal journal, he wrote, "I believe the Lord has put his money in my hands for safekeeping." That conviction, simple, unshakable, and dangerous, would propel him beyond business into the realm of myth. For the first time in history, a family's fortune would not merely sustain its heirs, it would define an era. From Eliza's wooden kitchen table to the marble corridors of Kaikut, the line of faith and calculation was unbroken. The dynasty had found its roots not in nobility or land, but in the discipline of the mind and the certainty of divine purpose. As America prepared to enter its age of iron and oil, the Rockefellers stood poised at its gate. Their creed was not conquest, but control, not indulgence, but intention. And from that creed, an empire was about to rise, one that would illuminate the world and darken its conscience at the same time. By the early 1870s, the sound of Cleveland's refineries had become the pulse of a nation learning the language of industry. Along the banks of the Cuyahoga River, a forest of chimneys exhaled black smoke into the pale Ohio sky. Beneath those clouds, John Davison Rockefeller moved quietly, a man of stillness commanding a world in motion. He no longer viewed business as commerce, he saw it as stewardship. Where others chased fortune, Rockefeller sought structure. He called his creation Standard Oil, a phrase that would soon become both symbol and accusation. It began as a modest partnership, but under his steady hand it transformed into something America had never seen, a machinery of order, a cathedral of efficiency. By the year 1872, Rockefeller executed what history would later call the Cleveland Massacre. Within a few short months, he absorbed or dismantled nearly all of the competing refineries in the region, not through violence or bribery, but through precision. He offered his rivals shares in his company, promising stability in exchange for surrender. To those who refused, he offered silence through extinction. "Competition is waste," he declared. "Cooperation is progress." Railroads bent to his logic. Secret rebates and contracts ensured that Standard Oil paid less to transport its products than any competitor could dream. In time, the network of pipes, tanks, and depots that carried oil across the continent belonged almost entirely to him. America's new bloodstream was liquid fire, and Rockefeller controlled its flow. To his critics, he was the high priest of monopoly. To his followers, he was the prophet of order. Each refinery under his command functioned like a chapel of discipline. Floors spotless, accounts exact, workers bound by quiet obedience. Efficiency, to him, was not a tactic, it was a moral act. Waste was sin. Profit, earned through mastery, was grace. As Standard Oil spread from Cleveland to New York, from New York to the harbors of London, Its founder's influence expanded beyond commerce into conscience. He prayed before mergers, tithed before dividends, and read scripture before breakfast. To the astonishment of his peers, this man who owned the world's light lived with almost monastic restraint. By the middle of the 1880s, Standard Oil refined more than 9/10 of the petroleum in the United States and exported kerosene to the farthest corners of the globe. It illuminated cities from Bombay to Buenos Aires, turning night into profit. Rockefeller's fortune grew faster than imagination could measure, yet his daily life remained austere. He wore simple suits, avoided wine, and began each morning with a hymn. When New York society danced under chandeliers, the Rockefellers prayed under candlelight. He and his wife, Laura Celestia Spellman, raised their children within a code of moral arithmetic, every pleasure weighed against purpose, every luxury questioned by conscience. Their home on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland was elegant but unpretentious, a statement of control in an era intoxicated by display. In the 1890s, his architectural ambitions found a different voice. At 26 Broadway, the headquarters of Standard Oil rose above Lower Manhattan, not a palace, but a fortress of precision. Inside, thousands of employees moved with mechanical rhythm. Every letter, every invoice, every calculation passed through pneumatic tubes in a ritual of order. To Rockefeller, the building was not merely an office, it was the physical expression of his theology of control. Yet outside its marble facade, resentment brewed. Journalists began to investigate the methods behind the empire. Competitors whispered of secret pacts with railroads, of predatory pricing, of small refiners crushed beneath invisible pressure. In the first years of the 20th century, a woman named Ida Minerva Tarbell published The History of the Standard Oil Company. Her meticulous investigation transformed the private empire into a public scandal. Tarbell did not merely describe business, she described moral corrosion. Her pages painted Rockefeller as a calculating despot who spoke of God while crushing men. America, already uneasy with the excess of its Gilded Age, found in her words the perfect symbol of its anxiety. The devout monopolist, the benevolent tyrant, Rockefeller remained silent. When journalists cornered him in the streets, he smiled politely, tipped his hat, and walked on. The press called him the Sphinx of Cleveland. To him, silence was discipline. He once wrote in his private notes, "The world condemns what it cannot comprehend." Still, his empire expanded. Standard Oil became a global organism, refineries in Europe, distribution in Asia, representation in South America. By the dawn of the new century, it controlled more than half of the world's refined oil. The kerosene lamp that flickered in a cottage in India or a parlor in England owed its flame to his arithmetic. But even arithmetic has a breaking point. The more perfect his order became, the more it threatened the disorder that democracy required. Reformers rose, armed not with swords, but with laws. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 had been written with men like Rockefeller in mind, but for years no one dared to use it against him. That hesitation ended in the first decade of the 20th century, when the federal government filed suit to dissolve his empire. The case dragged through courts for 5 long years. Then, on the 15th of May 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States delivered its verdict. Standard Oil must be broken into 34 independent companies. The empire of order had been legally shattered. To most men, this would have been ruin. To Rockefeller, it was multiplication. He owned stock in each of the new entities, Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, and many others, and as their values soared, his fortune tripled. What the law had destroyed, the market had redeemed. By that time, Rockefeller had already retired. In 1897, he withdrew from active management, dedicating himself to health, gardening, and what he called the higher work. His hair had fallen from stress. His digestion had failed from years of unrelenting tension. Yet his mind, sharpened by scripture, remained luminous. He began to build institutions. In the year 1892, his donations helped found the University of Chicago. In 1881, he had already endowed the creation of Spelman Seminary in Atlanta, later Spelman College, named for his wife's family. These were not gifts of guilt. They were the continuation of his belief that discipline should be taught, not inherited. In 1913, he created the Rockefeller Foundation, endowed with more than $100 million. Its purpose was vast, to advance science, education, and public health. From its funds would come the eradication of yellow fever, the establishment of modern medicine in China, and the birth of international philanthropy as a profession. Mark Twain, ever the chronicler of American paradox, observed that Rockefeller had done to charity what he had done to oil. He systematized it. By the time the Great War erupted in 1914, Rockefeller was an old man watching the world ignite with the very fuel he had mastered. Oil no longer illuminated lamps. It powered tanks and ships. The wealth that had promised light now carried fire. He spent his final years at Kaikouet, his estate above the Hudson River, tending gardens, counting blessings, and reading the Psalms. He once told a guest, "I have made many millions, but they have not made me." It was both confession and epitaph. When he died in the spring of 1937, he left behind not merely companies, but a concept that wealth could be moral if governed by purpose. The Rockefellers who followed him would inherit not only fortune but creed, that money must serve meaning, or it will consume its maker. Thus ended the golden era of oil and obedience, the reign of a man who believed that the kingdom of heaven could be managed through ledgers and light. By the second decade of the 20th century, the name Rockefeller had come to mean both power and peril. In churches, he was invoked as proof that faith could prosper. In newspapers, he was denounced as the living emblem of greed. Never before had one man embodied such opposing symbols, the saint of industry and the sinner of monopoly. His story had become America's moral mirror, reflecting both its triumph and its unease. The public's judgment reached its harshest voice after the dissolution of Standard Oil. Although the Supreme Court's decision in the year 1911 had made Rockefeller far richer than before, it left his reputation scarred. Journalists portrayed him as the architect of economic tyranny, the man who had strangled the free market with invisible hands. Political cartoons depicted him as an octopus, its tentacles wrapped around Congress, railroads, and the globe. The image was unforgettable. A bald, expressionless man in spectacles, smiling gently as he controlled the world's arteries. Yet beneath that caricature was an aging man whose health had begun to fail and whose conscience had grown restless. The body that once withstood 18-hour workdays now trembled with fatigue. His hair, already gone, was joined by eyebrows and lashes lost to stress. He rarely left his estate, Kaikouet, except for drives through the countryside, accompanied by the same calm silence that had both comforted and haunted him all his life. He received letters by the thousands, some begging for help, others condemning his soul. Many of them began with the same line, "You have too much." But Rockefeller, in his peculiar way, believed that wealth was not excess, it was responsibility. He had once written in his private notes, "God gave me my money. I shall endeavor to use it for His will." Still, even his iron conviction began to waver beneath the weight of public hatred. The storm reached its human peak in Colorado in the year 1914. The Ludlow Massacre, a violent clash between striking miners and the Colorado National Guard, left men, women, and children dead. The mines belonged to the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a subsidiary of the Rockefeller interests. Overnight, the name that had symbolized progress became synonymous with blood. Newspapers screamed "Rockefeller's War," and protesters across the nation burned him in effigy. At the time of the massacre, John Davison Rockefeller Sr. was 75 years old, living far from the conflict. His son, John Davison Rockefeller Jr., managed the family's business affairs and bore the brunt of the outrage. Jr., deeply religious and idealistic, was devastated. He had never visited the mines, yet now he was accused of murder. For months, angry crowds gathered outside his New York offices. "We want Rockefeller!" they shouted. "We want justice!" Public opinion was merciless. The Rockefeller name, once a pillar of American capitalism, had become its curse. Even clergy turned against them. One Baptist minister thundered from his pulpit, "No man can serve God and Rockefeller." For Jr., this was a moral crucible. He sought counsel from his father, whose advice was as calm as ever. Be firm in truth. The noise will pass. But it did not pass quickly. To confront the outrage, the Rockefellers took a radical step. They hired a public relations pioneer named Ivy Lee, one of the first men in history to craft image as strategy. Lee advised them to meet the people face to face to show the human side of wealth. In a move unprecedented for its time, John Davison Rockefeller Jr. visited the mines himself. He spoke with workers, shook their hands, and promised reforms in housing, safety, and wages. Photographs of the event circulated worldwide. The son of the world's richest man standing among coal-stained laborers, listening as if to confess. It was not a performance. It was revelation. America witnessed something new, a dynasty trying to make peace with democracy. The elder Rockefeller followed the events from his study at Kikuit. He had long ceased to manage his empire. Yet he understood that his greatest creation, the idea of wealth as virtue, was under siege. He increased his donations to education, medicine, and religion. Hospitals, universities, and public health campaigns now bore the name Rockefeller. But philanthropy could not fully erase suspicion. The public remained wary of charity born from conquest. Even his religion came under scrutiny. Critics accused him of using faith to justify exploitation, citing his lifelong belief that business was divine duty. But Rockefeller's piety was not performance. It was habit. He rose at dawn for scripture, avoided idle talk, and ended every day with prayer. He read the book of Proverbs as though it were a business manual. Its verses on diligence, prudence, and humility were the laws by which he had ruled his empire. Yet the same faith that gave him peace also blinded him to the pain his system inflicted on others. Within the family, the tension between faith and responsibility deepened. John Davison Rockefeller Jr. resolved to transform the dynasty's image. He distanced himself from corporate control and devoted his energy to philanthropy, culture, and urban reform. He helped finance the construction of Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, a project that would employ tens of thousands during the Great Depression and stand as a monument not to oil, but to renewal. The Rockefeller women, too, became forces of moral influence. Laura Spelman Rockefeller, before her passing, had founded charities for education and women's rights. Their daughter, Edith Rockefeller McCormick, patronized art and psychology, supporting the early work of Carl Jung. The family that had once been accused of draining the nation's blood now sought to enrich its spirit. Still, the elder Rockefeller remained an enigma. Visitors to Kikuit described him as gentle yet detached, a man of infinite courtesy but distant eyes. He lived by a rigid routine. A walk at sunrise, correspondence at mid-morning, golf in the afternoon, prayer at dusk. He gave away millions each year but rarely discussed it. Do good quietly, he advised. Noise is vanity. There was irony in that silence. The louder the world grew, cars, radios, factories, the quieter Rockefeller became. In his solitude, he tended gardens as though to make peace with the earth he had so thoroughly exploited. Roses and azaleas replaced derricks and pipelines. He watched grandchildren play under the same trees where, years before, he had prayed for guidance. Time, at last, had humbled him. By the late 1920s, the American economy had entered the age of speculation he had always warned against. When the stock market collapsed in the autumn of 1929, Rockefeller, already in his 90s, suffered not financially, but spiritually. He was disturbed to see millions of ordinary investors ruined by the very greed he had spent a lifetime disciplining within himself. "I tried to make money serve," he said quietly to a visitor. "Now it rules." His words carried the weight of prophecy. For in that moment, the empire of oil and order he had built no longer defined the future. The age of industrial monarchs was ending. The age of corporations without faces was beginning. Rockefeller's legacy, both light and shadow, had become the blueprint for a world he could no longer recognize. And yet, even amid decline, there was redemption. The Rockefeller Foundation's work in medicine and education expanded across continents. It funded the development of vaccines, public health systems, and agricultural reforms. In doing so, the dynasty that once monopolized fuel began to distribute hope. In his final years, John Davison Rockefeller Sr. grew increasingly reflective. He read scripture less as commandment and more as comfort. When a reporter once asked him near his 100th birthday what he considered the secret of success, he replied simply, "Singleness of purpose." It was the creed that had built his empire and the burden that had haunted his soul. He died in the spring of 1937, at 97 years old, in the same quiet discipline with which he had lived. No extravagant funeral, no gilded monuments, only hymns, prayers, and the whisper of gratitude from those whose lives his fortune had touched. The world remembered him not as a man of oil, but as the paradox of American faith itself, proof that greatness and guilt can share the same heart. The dark side of the Rockefeller story was never crime, it was consequence. In seeking to impose order upon chaos, he created a system so vast it outgrew morality. He proved that wealth can illuminate the world, but it can never cleanse its shadow. And so, the dynasty entered its next generation bearing not only riches, but a question. Could faith survive success? Could philanthropy redeem power? The answers would unfold not in boardrooms or pulpits, but in the slow transformation of wealth into wisdom, a legacy still unfinished. By the time John Davison Rockefeller Sr. passed away in the spring of 1937, the empire he had built no longer resembled the world he had imagined. His name still commanded reverence and resentment, yet America itself had transformed. The nation that once worshipped its industrial kings had begun to question the morality of wealth itself. The age of oil barons was fading into myth. The Great Depression had stripped the glamour from prosperity. Mansions once filled with laughter stood empty, their chandeliers dimmed by the dust of economic ruin. Factories closed, workers queued for bread, and Wall Street, once the altar of ambition, lay in ruins. Rockefeller, whose fortune had survived every storm, watched this unraveling with a quiet sadness. "The rich must guard their souls more carefully than their fortunes," he once said to his son. "It is not money that fails a man, but pride." After his death, stewardship passed entirely to John Davison Rockefeller Jr., a man molded by faith, yet burdened by guilt. He inherited not just wealth but scrutiny. The public expected redemption. The son of the oil monarch would have to prove that the dynasty's riches could serve a moral purpose in a broken world. Jr. accepted the mission with solemn conviction. He withdrew from the ruthless mechanics of business and poured his energy into restoration, not of oil, but of the human spirit. In the heart of Manhattan, amid the gray despair of the 1930s, he envisioned a project that would unite art, labor, and hope. Rockefeller Center. It began modestly, a plan to build offices and studios to employ thousands during the Depression, but soon it became a symbol of renewal. Rising from the bedrock of Midtown, its limestone towers reached toward the sky like modern cathedrals. Murals adorned its halls, celebrating progress and peace. At its center stood a golden statue of Prometheus, the bringer of fire, a silent echo of the oil that had once ignited the family's fortune. Rockefeller Center was completed in the early 1940s, just as the world plunged into another war. It was more than architecture. It was contrition cast in stone. Where Standard Oil had dominated commerce, this complex sought to elevate culture. It embodied Jr.'s belief that power must yield to service, and that legacy, to endure, must be shared. Beyond New York, the dynasty expanded its reach into the social fabric of modern America. The Rockefeller Foundation became a global institution, shaping medicine, agriculture, and education across continents. It funded the development of vaccines, improved public health systems, and supported agricultural innovation through what would later be called the Green Revolution. Yet even as their philanthropy grew, the aura of dominance began to dissolve. The world of private empires was giving way to corporate democracies, entities governed not by patriarchs, but by boards, laws, and shareholders. The moral certainty that had guided John Davison Rockefeller Sr. seemed antiquated in an age of bureaucracy. The Titan's descendants had become administrators of influence, not creators of it. The Second World War accelerated that transition. Oil, once the emblem of Rockefeller's private power, became a tool of nations. The United States government regulated its distribution, coordinated its production, and ensured its flow to armies across the globe. The substance that had built one man's fortune now powered the machinery of civilization itself. The monopoly had dissolved into the bloodstream of modernity. Within the family, the shift from empire to legacy deepened. John Davison Rockefeller Jr., modest and meticulous, lived not for conquest but for reconciliation. He funded churches, restored colonial Williamsburg, and donated vast tracts of land for national parks, including Grand Teton in Wyoming and Acadia in Maine. In doing so, he redefined the family's purpose. No longer builders of wealth, but caretakers of heritage. Still, the dynasty could not entirely escape the shadows of its origin. The memory of monopoly lingered, resurfacing whenever new scandals of corporate greed arose. The Rockefeller name remained both admired and mistrusted, a symbol of order achieved through dominance. The family understood this paradox and began to navigate it with humility. They replaced secrecy with transparency, grandeur with service. By the mid-20th century, the younger Rockefellers had entered public life. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, the grandson of John Davison Rockefeller Sr., rose to political prominence as governor of New York and later vice president of the United States. His brothers Lawrence, Winthrop, David, and John III became philanthropists, environmentalists, and bankers. Together, they represented the final flowering of a dynasty transformed from commerce to conscience. Nelson Rockefeller embodied the modern version of the family creed. He believed that wealth must be active, dynamic, and visible in its good. His tenure in politics reflected a conviction inherited from his grandfather, that power, to remain moral, must serve. Yet, unlike his forebears, he lived in an age that no longer revered dynasties. The old aura of divine purpose had faded. America now trusted corporations more than men, systems more than souls. David Rockefeller, the youngest and perhaps most enduring of the brothers, became the face of this new order. As chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, he transformed financial power into global diplomacy. He met world leaders, financed development projects, and advocated for international cooperation. The grandson of the oil baron became a statesman of capitalism, symbolizing its global reach and moral ambiguity. But even as the family expanded its influence into finance, philanthropy, and politics, something essential was quietly ending. The spiritual intensity that had defined John Davison Rockefeller Sr., his belief in divine stewardship and moral mathematics, could not survive the modern age. His descendants were still generous, still powerful, but their giving was guided by expertise rather than faith. What had begun as a moral mission had evolved into an institution. By the 1970s, the Rockefellers were no longer the richest family in America. New fortunes, technology, entertainment, and global trade had taken their place. The oil empire had long since merged into multinational corporations beyond personal control. The dynasty that once embodied the American dream had become part of the American system. Yet decline for the Rockefellers was never collapse. It was transformation, the shedding of monarchy into legacy. They remained symbols of endurance, of a wealth that had learned to survive not by expansion, but by adaptation. Their name adorned museums, universities, and humanitarian causes rather than refineries or railroads. In the twilight of the 20th century, David Rockefeller reflected on his lineage in his memoirs. He wrote, "We are not what people think we are. We are not the keepers of wealth, we are its witnesses." It was the closest the family came to confession. Thus, the fall of the Rockefeller dynasty was not a fall into ruin, but into relevance, the realization that no fortune, however vast, could command the future forever. The oil that once defined their power had become the lifeblood of nations, and the ethics that once sanctified their fortune had dissolved into the complexity of global capitalism. The man who began with a ledger and a prayer had given birth to an era that could no longer measure morality in balance sheets. His empire's decline was, in truth, the world's inheritance. For in dismantling the monopoly of one man, history had built the system by which modern power would forever operate. Invisible, immense, and morally unresolved. And so, as the century turned, the Rockefellers faded from public awe into quiet ubiquity, their influence woven into the foundations of universities, banks, and hospitals. The dynasty had not vanished. It had dissolved into the fabric of the world it helped create. At dawn, the Hudson River still mirrors the hills of Pocantico. The gardens of Kikuit bloom each spring, as if time itself remembers its master. Yet the world beyond its gates has changed beyond recognition. The derricks that once lit the night have given way to satellites and screens. The empire of oil has dissolved into the atmosphere of globalization. And still, the Rockefeller name endures not as dynasty, but as idea. John Davison Rockefeller believed that money, like faith, required discipline. A century after his death, that belief survives in institutions rather than individuals. The Rockefeller Foundation continues to fund global health, climate research, and humanitarian innovation. The University of Chicago, Spelman College, and the Rockefeller University remain living monuments to the notion that wealth, if governed by conscience, can elevate the mind as surely as it once fueled machines. His descendants no longer rule industries. They advise, curate, and sustain. The family's modern generations manage philanthropic trusts, environmental programs, and art endowments. They walk more quietly than their forebears, aware that the privilege of the name carries an obligation to humility. Their gatherings are no longer about dividends, but about preservation of heritage, of integrity, of relevance. Yet the legacy of John Davison Rockefeller cannot be measured solely in generosity. It lies in the moral architecture he imposed on capitalism, the conviction that profit must serve purpose. He systematized giving as rigorously as he systematized oil, creating a blueprint that would define 20th-century philanthropy from the Carnegies and Mellons to the Gates and Buffetts of a later age. His creed, to make money the servant of God, not its master, reshaped the ethical vocabulary of wealth itself. Still, the question he posed remains unresolved. Can morality coexist with power? Can philanthropy ever redeem exploitation? The answers drift through history like the smoke that once rose from his refineries, visible, persuasive, but never permanent. Every generation that inherits his fortune inherits also his dilemma: how to balance grace with gain, light with shadow. In the museums his family built, portraits of Rockefeller show a calm, impassive face, the gaze of a man certain that order could be divine. Yet behind that calm lies the knowledge that order always demands a price. His life was both proof and warning that the pursuit of control, even in the name of faith, can shape the world and wound it at once. And perhaps that is why his story endures. For in John Davison Rockefeller's journey, America saw itself. Its restless ambition, its moral doubt, its desire to reconcile salvation with success. The dynasty he founded no longer reigns, but its echo persists in every foundation grant, in every research laboratory, in every notion that wealth carries duty. As evening falls over the Hudson, the last light touches the dome of Kikuit. The wind moves through the stone terraces, whispering across the fountains where his grandchildren once played. It is the sound of a century breathing faith and fortune, devotion and doubt. In that quiet, the legacy of the Rockefellers is neither triumph nor tragedy. It is reflection, the enduring reminder that power, when guided by purpose, can aspire toward grace, but never escape its shadow. And somewhere, beyond the marble in the gardens, the voice of the old man seems to murmur once more. It is more blessed to give than to receive. From the quiet prayers of a devout boy in upstate New York to the marble halls of Kikuit overlooking the Hudson, the Rockefeller Dynasty traces the journey of one man who turned oil into light and wealth into faith. John Davison Rockefeller rose from humble beginnings under the guidance of his mother, Eliza Davison, to become the richest man in modern history, founder of Standard Oil, and architect of a new kind of empire built not on nobility, but on efficiency and divine purpose. His disciplined belief that profit must serve God transformed capitalism into creed. Yet beneath the symmetry of his empire lay a conflict between conscience and control. The monopolies he built illuminated the world, but darkened his public image. Accused of greed and corruption, vilified by journalists, and haunted by the violence of the Ludlow massacre, Rockefeller turned inward, channeling his faith into philanthropy. Through institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, and Spelman College, his fortune began to serve the public good, reshaping science, medicine, and education worldwide. The dynasty's later generations from John Davison Rockefeller Jr. to David Rockefeller carried that mission forward, replacing conquest with compassion. Today, the Rockefellers no longer reign over oil fields, but over ideas, sustainability, culture, and global responsibility. Their story remains both inspiration and warning, a testament that faith may guide fortune, but never absolve it. In the echo of time, the name Rockefeller no longer means monopoly. It means the eternal struggle to use power for purpose.